This audio is for educational purposes only. I hope this will add light to your journey. Please share this audio to your loved ones, family and friends. Thank you.
10th Insight, Part 2, Reviewing the Journey. On a rock above my head, half obscured by an overhanging ledge, stood Will, his hands on his hips, smiling broadly. He appeared slightly out of focus, so I blinked hard and concentrated, and his face cleared somewhat. "I knew you would be here," he said, nimbly climbing off the ledge and jumping to the rock beside me. "I've been waiting." I looked at him in awe, and he pulled me into an embrace. His face and hands looked slightly luminescent, but otherwise seemed normal. "I can't believe you're here," I stammered. "What happened when you disappeared in Peru? Where have you been?" He gestured for me to sit facing him on a nearby shelf. "I'll tell you everything," he said, "but first, I have to know about you. What circumstances brought you to this valley?" In detail, I told him about Charlene's disappearance, the map of the valley, and meeting David. Will wanted to know more of what David had said, so I told him everything I could remember about the conversation. Will leaned toward me. "He told you the 10th was about understanding the spiritual renaissance on Earth, in light of the other dimension, and learning the true nature of your intuitions." "Yes," I said. "Is that right?" He seemed to think for a moment, then asked, "What has been your experience since entering the valley?" I immediately started to see images. I said, "Some were of other historical times, but then I began to see repeated visions of this pool. I saw everything, the rocks, the falls, even that someone was waiting here, although I didn't know it was you." "Where were you in the scene?" "It was as if I was walking up and seeing it, so it was a scene of a potential future for you." I squinted at him. "I'm not sure I follow. The first part of the 10th, as David said, is about understanding our intuitions more fully. In the first 9 insights, one experiences intuitions as fleeting gut feelings or vague hunches, but as we gain familiarity with this phenomenon, we can now grasp the nature of these intuitions more clearly. Think back to Peru. Didn't intuitions come to you as pictures of what was going to happen? Images of yourself and others at a specific location, doing certain things, leading you to go there. Wasn't that how you knew when to go to the Celestine ruins? Here, in the valley, the same thing has been happening. You received a mental image of a potential event, finding the falls, and meeting someone, and you were able to live it out, bringing on the coincidence of actually discovering the location and encountering me. If you had shrugged off the image, or lost faith in looking for the falls, you would have missed the synchronicity, and your life would have stayed flat. But you took the image seriously. You kept it in your mind." David said something about learning to maintain the intuition. I said. Will nodded. "What about the other images?" I asked. "The scenes of an earlier time. And what about these animals? Does the 10th insight talk about all this? Have you seen the manuscript?" With a gesture of his hand, Will waved off my questions. "First, let me tell you about my experience in the other dimension, what I call the afterlife dimension, when I was able to maintain my energy level in Peru, even when the rest of you grew fearful and lost your vibration. I found myself in an incredible world of beauty and clear form. I was right there, in the same place, but everything was different. The world was luminous and awing, in a way I still can't describe. For a long time, I just walked around in this incredible world, vibrating even higher, and then I discovered something quite amazing. I could will myself anywhere on the planet, just by imaging a destination in my mind. I traveled everywhere I could think of, looking for you and Julia, and the others, but I couldn't find any of you. Finally, I began to detect another ability. By imaging, just a blank field in my mind, I could travel off the planet, into a place of pure ideas. There, I could create anything I wanted. Just by imaging it, I made oceans, and mountains, and scenic vistas, images of people, who behaved just as I wanted, all kinds of things, and every bit of it seemed just as real as anything on Earth. Yet, in the end, I realized that such a constructed world was not a fulfilling place. Just creating arbitrarily gave me no inner satisfaction. After a while, I went home and thought about what I wanted to do. At that time, I could still become dense enough that I could talk with most people of a higher awareness. I could eat and sleep, although I didn't have to. Finally, I realized that I had forgotten about the thrill of evolving and experiencing coincidences, because I was already so buoyant. I had mistakenly thought that I was maintaining my inner connection, but, in fact, I had become too controlling, and had lost my path. It is very easy to lose one's way at this level of vibration, because it is so easy and instantaneous to create with one's will. What happened then? I asked. I focused within, looking for a higher connection with divine energy, just the way we've always done it. That's all it took. My vibration rose even higher, and I began to receive intuitions again. I saw an image of you. What was I doing? I couldn't tell. The image was hazy, but when I thought about the intuition and maintained it in my mind, I began to move into a new area of the afterlife, where I could actually see other souls, groups of souls, really, and while I couldn't exactly speak to them, I could vaguely pick up on their thoughts and knowledge. Were they able to show you the 10th insight? I asked. He swallowed hard and looked at me as though he was about to land a bombshell. No, the 10th insight has never been written down. What? It's not part of the original manuscript. No. Does it even exist? Oh yes, it exists, but not in the earthly dimension. This insight hasn't made it to the physical plane yet. This knowledge exists only in the afterlife. Only when enough people on Earth sense this information intuitively can it become real enough in everyone's consciousness for someone to write it down. That's what happened with the first 9 insights. In fact, that's what has happened with all spiritual texts, even our most sacred scriptures. Always, it is information that first exists in the afterlife, and is finally picked up clearly enough in the physical dimension to be manifested by someone who is supposed to write it down. That's why these writings are called divinely inspired. So, why has it taken so long for someone to grasp the 10th? Will looked perplexed. I don't know. The soul group I was communicating with seemed to know, but I couldn't quite understand. My energy level was not high enough. It has something to do with the fear that arises in a culture that is moving from a material reality to a transformed spiritual worldview. Then, you think the 10th is ready to come in. Yes, the soul group saw the 10th coming in. Now, bit by bit, all over the world, as we gain a higher perspective that comes from a knowledge of the afterlife, but it has to be grasped in sufficient numbers, just as with the first 9, in order to overcome the fear. Do you know what the rest of the 10th is about? Yes, apparently, just knowing the first 9 isn't enough. We have to understand how we will implement this destiny. Such knowledge comes from grasping the special relationship between the physical dimension and the afterlife. We have to understand the birth process, where we come from, the larger picture of what human history is trying to accomplish. A thought suddenly came to me. Wait a minute, weren't you able to see a copy of the 9th insight? What did it say about the 10th? Will leaned toward me. It said, that the first 9 insights have described the reality of spiritual evolution, both personally and collectively, but actually implementing these insights, living them, and fulfilling this destiny, requires a fuller understanding of the process. A 10th insight. This insight would show us the reality of Earth's spiritual transformation, not just from the perspective of the earthly dimension, but from the perspective of the afterlife dimension as well. It said, we would understand more fully why we were uniting the dimensions, why humans must fulfill this historical purpose, and it would be this understanding, once integrated into culture, that would ensure this eventual outcome. It also mentioned the fear, saying that, at the same time, a new spiritual awareness was emerging. A reactive polarization would also rise up, in fearful opposition, seeking to willfully control the future, with various new technologies even more dangerous than the nuclear menace, that are already being discovered. The 10th insight resolves this polarization. He stopped abruptly, and nodded toward the east. Do you hear that? I listened, but could hear only the falls. What? I asked. That hum, I heard it earlier. What is it? I'm not sure exactly, but it can be heard in the other dimension as well. The souls I saw seemed very disturbed about it. As Will spoke, I clearly saw Charlene's face. In the back of my mind, do you think the hum is related to this new technology? I asked, partially distracted. Will didn't answer. I noticed he had an absent look on his face. The friend that you're looking, blonde hair, and large eyes. Yes, I just saw an image of her face. I stared at him. So did I. He turned and looked at the falls for a moment, and Foland spray formed majestically below his gaze. The white foam, I could feel the energy increasing. Background to our conversation. Yet, he said, but because you don't have enough energy. If I help, and we both focus, this place is so powerful. I think that, fully into the spiritual dimension of your friend's face, we can move soon, and maybe find out where she is, and what's happening in this valley. Maybe you can go, and are you sure I can do that? I said, I can wait here for you. His face was fading out of focus. Will touched my lower back, giving me energy, smiling again. Don't you see how purposeful it is that we are here, human, the afterlife, and grasp the culture is beginning to understand, to explore the other dimension. I think we have the opportunity together. You know, this feels destined. Eyes of the hum in the back. At that moment, I noticed the falls. In fact, I could feel it in ground, even over the sound of it in my solar plexus now. The hum's getting louder. Will said, we have to go in. Charlene could be in trouble. What do we do? I asked, still touching my back. We have. Will moved slightly closer. To recreate the image we received of your friend. Maintain it. Yes, as I said, we are leaning to recognize and believe in inquisitive looking. Our intuitions at a higher level. We all want the coincidences to come more consistently. But, for most of us, this awareness is new, and we're surrounded by a culture that still operates too much in the old skepticism, so we lose the expectation, the faith. Yet, what we are beginning to realize is that, when we fully pay attention, inspecting the details of the potential future was shown, purposely keeping the image in the back of our minds, intentionally believing, when we do this, then, whatever we are imaging, tends to happen more readily. Then, we will it to happen. No, remember my experience, in the afterlife, there, you can make anything happen, just by wishing it so. But, such creation isn't fulfilling. The same is true of this dimension, only everything moves at a slower rate. On Earth, we can will and create almost anything we wish, but real fulfillment comes only when we first tune into our inner direction and divine guidance. Only then Do we use our will to move toward the potential futures we received? In this sense, we become co-creators with the divine source. Do you see how this knowledge begins the 10th insight? We are learning to use our visualization in the same way it is used in the afterlife, and when we do, we fall into alignment with that dimension, and that helps unite heaven and earth. I nodded, understanding completely. After taking several deep breaths, Will exerted more pressure on my back and instructed me to recreate the details of Charlene's face. For a moment, nothing happened, and then, suddenly, I felt a rush of energy, twisting me forward and pushing me into a wild acceleration. I was streaking at fantastic speeds through a multicolored tunnel of some kind. Fully conscious, I wondered why I had no fear, for what I really felt was a sense of recognition and contentment and peace, as though I had been here before. When the movement stopped, I found myself in an environment of warm, white light. I looked for Will and realized he was standing to my left and slightly behind me. "There you are," he said, smiling. His lips weren't moving, but I could clearly hear his voice. I then noticed the appearance of his body. He looked exactly the same, except he seemed to be completely illuminated from within. I reached over to touch his hand and noticed that my body appeared the same way. When I touched him, what I felt was a field several inches outside the arm I could see. Pushing harder, I realized I couldn't penetrate this energy. I only moved his body away from me. Will was near bursting with mirth. In fact, his expression was so humorous that I laughed myself. "Amazing, isn't it?" he asked. "This is a higher vibration than at the Celestine ruins." I replied, "Do you know where we are?" Will was silent, gazing out at our surroundings. We seemed to be in an environment that was spatial, and we had a sense of up and down, but we were suspended motionless in midair, and there were no horizons. The white light was a constant hue in all directions. Finally, Will said, "This is an observation point. I came here briefly when I first imaged your face. More souls were here. What were they doing?" "Observing the people who had come over after death." "What, you mean, this is where people come right after they have died?" "Yes." "Why are we here? Has something happened to Charlene?" He turned more directly toward me. "No, I don't think so. Remember what happened to me when I began to image you? I moved to many locations before we finally met at the falls. There's probably something we need to see here before we can find Charlene. Let's wait and see what happens with these souls." He nodded to our left, where several human-like entities were materializing directly in front of us, at a distance of what appeared to be about 30 feet. My first reaction was to be cautious. "Will, how do we know their intentions are friendly? What if they try to possess us? Or something?" He gave me a serious expression. "How do you know if someone on Earth is trying to control you?" I would pick up on it. I could tell that the person was being manipulative. What else? I guess they would be taking energy away from me. I would feel a decrease in my sense of wisdom, self-direction. Exactly. They wouldn't be following the insights. All these principles work the same way in both dimensions. As the entities formed completely, I remained cautious, but eventually I felt a loving and supportive energy emanating from their bodies, which seemed to be comprised of a whitish amber light that danced and shimmered in and out of focus. Their faces had human characteristics, but could not be looked at directly. I couldn't even tell how many souls were there. At one moment, 3 or 4 seemed to be facing us. Then I would blink, and there would be 6. Then 3 again, all dancing in and out of view. Overall, they looked like a flickering, animated cloud of amber against the background color of white. After several minutes, another form began to materialize beside the others. Only this figure was more clearly in focus, and appeared in a luminous body, similar to Will and myself. We could see that it was a middle-aged man. He looked around wildly, then saw the group of souls, and began to relax. To my surprise, when I focused closely on him, I could pick up on what he was feeling and thinking. I glanced at Will, who nodded that he was also sensing the person's reaction. I focused again, and observed that, in spite of a certain detachment and sense of love and support, he was in a state of shock at having discovered he had died. Only minutes before, he had been routinely jogging, and, while attempting to run up a long hill, had suffered a massive heart attack. The pain had lasted only a few seconds, and then, he was hovering outside his body, watching a stream of bystanders rush up to help him. Soon, a team of paramedics arrived, and worked feverishly to bring him back. As he sat beside his body in the ambulance, he had listened in horror as the team leader had pronounced him dead. Frantically, he had attempted to communicate, but no one could hear. At the hospital, a doctor confirmed to the crew that his heart had literally exploded, that no one could have done anything to save his life. Part of him tried to accept the fact. Another resisted. How could he be dead? He had called out for help, and had instantly found himself in a tunnel of colors that had brought him to where he now stood. As we watched, he seemed to become more aware of the souls, and moved toward them, shifting out of focus to us, appearing more like them. Then, abruptly he pulled back toward us, and was quickly surrounded by an office of some kind, filled with computers and wall charts, and people working. Everything looked perfectly real, except the walls were semi-transparent, so that we could see what was happening inside, and the sky above the office was not blue, but a strange olive color. He's deluding himself, Will said. He's recreating the office where he worked on Earth, trying to pretend he hasn't died. The souls moved closer, and others came, until there were dozens of them, all flickering in and out of focus in the amber light. They seemed to be sending the man love, and some kind of information I couldn't understand. Gradually, the constructed office began to fade, and eventually disappeared completely. The man was left with an expression of resignation on his face, and he again moved into focus with the souls. "Let's go with them," I heard Will say. At the same moment, I felt his arm, or rather, the energy of his arm, pushing against my back. As soon as I inwardly agreed, there was the slight sensation of movement, and the souls, and the man, all came into clearer focus. The souls now had glowing faces, much as Will and I did, but their hands and feet, instead of being clearly formed, were mere radiations of light. I could now focus on the entities for as long as 4 or 5 seconds, before losing them, and having to blink to find them again. I became aware that the group of souls, as well as the deceased individual, was watching an intense point of bright light moving toward us. It eventually swelled into a massive beam that covered everything. Unable to look directly at the light, I turned so I could just see the silhouette of the man, who was staring fully at the beam, without apparent difficulty. Again, I could pick up on his thoughts and emotions. The light was filling him with an unimaginable sense of love and calm perspective. As this sensation swept over him, his viewpoint and knowledge expanded, until he could clearly see the life he had just lived, from a broad and amazingly detailed perspective. Immediately, he could see the circumstances of his birth and early family life. He was born John Donald Williams, to a father who was slow intellectually, and to a mother who was extremely detached and absent because of her involvement in various social events. He himself had grown up angry and defiant, an interrogator, eager to prove to the world that he was a brilliant achiever who could master science and mathematics. He earned a doctorate in physics, at MIT, at age 23, and taught at 4 prestigious universities, before moving on to the Defense Department, and then, later, to a private energy corporation. Clearly, he had thrown himself into this latter position with total abandon and disregard for his health. After years of fast food and no exercise, he was diagnosed with a chronic heart condition. An exercise routine, pursued too aggressively, had proved fatal. He had died in his prime at age 58. At this point, Williams' awareness shifted, and he began to have profound regrets and severe emotional pain concerning the way he had led his life. He realized that his childhood and early family had been set up perfectly to expose what was already his soul's tendency, to use defiance and elitism, to feel more important. His main tool had been ridicule, putting down others by criticizing their abilities and work ethic and personality. Yet, now he could see that all the teachers had been in place to help him overcome this insecurity. All of them had arrived at just the right time to show him another way, but he had ignored them completely. Instead, he had just pursued his tunnel vision to the end. All the signs had been there to choose his work more carefully, to slow down. There were a multitude of implications and dangers inherent in his research of new technologies that he had failed to consider. He had allowed his employers to feed him new theories and even unfamiliar physical principles without even questioning their origin. These procedures worked, and that was all he cared about, because they led to success, gratitude, recognition. He had succumbed to his need for recognition. Again, my God, he thought, I've failed, just as I did before. His mind abruptly shifted to a new scene, an earlier existence. He was in the southern Appalachians, 19th century, a military outpost. In a large tent, several men leaned over a map. Lanterns flickered their light against the walls. A consensus had been reached among all the field officers present. There was no hope for peace. Now, war was inevitable, and sound military principles dictated an attack, quickly. As one of the commanding general's top 2 aides, Williams had been forced to concur with the others. No other choice existed, he had concluded. Disagreement would have ended his career. Besides, he couldn't have dissuaded the others, even if he had wanted to. The offensive would have to be carried out. Likely, the last major battle in the Eastern War against the natives. A sentry interrupted with a communication for the general. A settler wanted to see the commander immediately. Looking through the open tent flap, Williams had seen the frail white woman, perhaps 30, desperation in her eyes. He found out later that she was the daughter of a missionary, bringing word of a possible new Native American initiative for peace, an appeal that she personally had negotiated at great risk. But the general had refused to see her, remaining in the tent as she shouted at him, finally ordering her from his camp at gunpoint, not knowing the content of her message, not wanting to know. Again, Williams kept quiet. He knew his commander was under great pressure, having already promised that the region would be opened up for economic expansion. A war was necessary if the vision of the power brokers and the political allies was to be actualized. It was not enough to let the settlers and the Indians create their own frontier culture. No, in their view, the future had to be shaped and manipulated and controlled for the best interests of those who made the world secure and abundant. It would be far too frightening and altogether irresponsible to let the little people decide. Williams knew that a war would greatly please the railroad and coal tycoons and the newly emerging oil interests, and would, of course, ensure his own future as well. All he had to do was keep his mouth shut and play along, and he would, under silent protest, unlike the general's other primary aide. He remembered looking across the room at his colleague, a small man who limped slightly. No one knew why he limped. Nothing was wrong with his leg. Here was the ultimate yes man. He knew what the secret cartels were up to, and he loved it, admired it, wanted to become a part of it. And there was something more. This man, like the general and the other controllers, feared the Native Americans and wanted them removed, not just because of the natives' alienation from the expanding industrial economy that was poised to overrun their lands. They feared these people because of something deeper, some terrifying and transformative idea, known in its entirety only by a few of the elders, but which bubbled up throughout their culture and called out for the controllers to change, to remember another vision of the future. Williams had found out that the missionary's daughter had arranged for the great medicine chiefs to come together in one last attempt to agree on this knowledge, to find the words to share it, one last bid to explain themselves, to establish their value to a world quickly turning against them. Williams had known, deep within, that the woman should have been heard, but, in the end, he had remained silent, and, with one quick nod, the general had pushed away the possibility of reconciliation, and had ordered the battle to begin. As we watched, William's recollection shifted to a gorge in the deep woods, site of the coming battle. Cavalry poured over a ridge. In a surprise offensive, the Native Americans rose to the defense, attacking the cavalry from the bluffs. On either side, a short distance away, a large man and a woman huddled among the rocks. The man was a young academic, a congressional aide, there only to observe. Terrified, he was this close to the battle. It was wrong, all wrong. His interest was economics. He knew nothing of violence. He had come there, convinced that the white man and the Indian need not be in conflict, that growing economic surge through the region might be adapted, evolved, integrated, to include both cultures. Beside him in the rocks was the young woman, seen at the military tent earlier. At this moment, she felt abandoned, betrayed. Her effort could have worked. She knew, if those with the power had listened to what was possible, but she would not give up. She had told herself, not until the violence stopped. She kept saying, it can be healed, it can be healed. Suddenly, on the downslope behind them, two cavalrymen rode hard toward a single native. I strained to see who it was, finally, recognizing the man as the angry chief I had seen in my mind when talking to David, the chief who had been so vocal against the white woman's ideas. As I watched, he turned quickly and shot an arrow into the chest of one of his pursuers. The other soldier leaped from his horse and fell upon the Native American. Both struggled furiously, the soldier's knife finally plunging deep into the throat of the darker man. Blood gushed across the torn ground. Watching the events, the panicked economist pleaded with the woman to flee with him, but she motioned for him to stay, to be calm. For the first time, Williams could see an old medicine man beside a tree next to them, his form flickering in and out of focus. At that instant, another troop of cavalry crested the rise and was on top of them, firing indiscriminately. Bullets tore through both the man and the woman. With a smile, the Indian defiantly stood and was likewise destroyed. At this point, Williams' focus drifted to a hill that overlooked the entire scene. Another individual was looking down on the battle. He was dressed in buckskins and led a pack mule, a mountain man. He turned from the battle and walked down the hill in the opposite direction, past the pool and falls, and then out of sight. I was astounded. The battle had taken place right here, in the valley, just south of the falls. When my attention returned to Williams, he was reliving the horror of the bloodshed and the hatred. He knew his failure to act during the Native American wars had set up the conditions and hopes of his most recent life. But, just as before, he had failed to awaken. He had been together again with the congressional aide who had been killed with the woman. and still he had failed to remember their mission. Williams intended to meet the younger man on a hilltop, among a circle of large trees, and there, his friend was supposed to awaken, and go on, to find 6 others in the valley, forming a group of 7. Together, the group was to help resolve the fear. The idea seemed to thrust him into a deeper recollection. Fear had been the great enemy throughout humanity's long and tortuous history, and he seemed to know that present human culture was polarizing, giving the controllers in this historical time one last opportunity to seize power, to exploit the new technologies for their own purpose. He seemed to cringe in agony. He knew that it was tremendously important for the group of 7 to come together. History was poised for such groups, and only if enough of them formed, and only if enough of them understood the fear, could the polarization be dispelled, and the experiments in the valley ended. Very slowly, I became aware that I was again in the place of soft, white light. William's visions had ended, and both he and the other entities had quickly vanished. Afterward, I had experienced a quick movement backward that had left me dizzy and distracted. I noticed Will beside me, to the right. What happened? I asked. Where did he go? I'm not sure, he replied. What was happening to him? He was experiencing a life review. I nodded. Are you aware of what that is? He asked. Yeah, I said. I know that people who have had near-death experiences often report that their whole lives flash before them. Is that what you mean? Will looked thoughtful. Yes, but the increased awareness of this review process is having great impact on human culture. It's another part of the higher perspective provided by a knowledge of the afterlife. Thousands of people have had near-death experiences, and as their stories are shared and talked about, the reality of the life review is becoming part of our everyday understanding. We know that after death, we have to look at our lives again, and we're going to agonize over every missed opportunity, over every case in which we failed to act. This knowledge is contributing to our determination to pursue every intuitive image that comes to mind, and keep it firmly in awareness. We're living life in a more deliberate way. We don't want to miss a single important event. We don't want the pain of looking back later and realizing that we blew it, that we failed to make the right decisions. Suddenly, Will paused, cocking his head, as though hearing something. Immediately, I felt another jolt in my solar plexus, and heard the dissonant hum again. Moments later, the sound faded. Will was looking around. The solid white environment was shimmering with intermittent streaks of dull gray. Whatever is going on is affecting this dimension too, he said. I don't know if we can maintain our vibration. As we waited, the dull streaks gradually diminished, and the solid white background returned. Remember the warning about new technology in the 9th insight, Will added, and William's comment about those in fear trying to control this technology. What about this group of 7 coming back? I asked. Aren't those visions that Williams was having of this valley in the 19th century? Will, I've seen 'em too. What do you think the visions mean? Will's expression grew more serious. I think all this is what we're supposed to be seeing, and I think you are part of the group. Suddenly, the hum began to increase again. Williams said, we first had to understand this fear. Will stressed, in order to help resolve it. That's what we have to do next. We have to find a way to understand this fear. Will had barely finished his thought when an ear-shattering sound tore through my body, pushing me backward. Will reached out for me, his face distorted and out of focus. I tried to grab his arm, but he was suddenly gone, and I was falling downward, out of control, amid a panorama of colors.